So thanks everyone tonight for joining us. And as I was saying backstage, it's nice, although I wish the Blazers were still in the playoffs, it's nice not to be going up against the Blazer playoffs. And we thank you for those who are dedicated to world affairs that joined us here for our last speaker, who was pretty incredible. Encourage you to take a look at our website, where we'll have some of that up on our YouTube channel if you missed it. We're going to have an interesting conversation here. Then, as I mentioned, pull in some questions. If you heard her today on OPB's Think Out Loud, she's an incredible speaker, and so I'm not going to be doing much of the talking. I'm going to be letting her do the talking. But before I go into the questions, I just want to highlight her book, How We Win. It is an incredible book. I just finished reading it myself, and it is very powerful with a lot of challenges for us as citizens or members of organizations or companies, how we could get involved to make a difference, or how our government could be doing more. So I would encourage you, after this, take a look. Our partner, Broadway Books, has this, and it's been selling well, they said there. And so I encourage you to take a look, because it really dives into some of these topics that we'll only sort of scratch the surface on today. But again, it's wonderful to have you here in Portland, and love for you just to start off a little bit talking about your years of public service. I as a former Foreign Service officer myself, I really appreciate your years of service. And you worked notably and uniquely, I would say, as an appointee both under the Bush and Obama administrations. That does not happen very often, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that and how you started this journey.
First of all, good evening to everybody, and thank you for welcoming me to this beautiful city. I've had a wonderful day here, and one of the things that I've been struck by is how kind and compassionate everybody is. They have a smile on their face when they say hello. It's not superficial, and I think that goes a long way, so I want to thank you for that. I think, and I want to thank you for your service when you were a Foreign Service officer. Public service is a calling. It is something that you do because you believe in something bigger, because you believe in our country, because you believe in our Constitution, because you understand how important it is to connect the dots of things that are going around the world, and that you don't isolate yourself. So Foreign Service officers are critically important to the work that we do. It's a huge sacrifice on your part. Political appointees usually come in for a short period of time and leave to go back into the world that they came from. I was uniquely lucky in many ways in my service to my nation. I had my first experience in public service right after college, actually, and I worked for President H.W. Bush because his wife was kind enough, Barbara Bush, to listen to a speech that I gave about diversity when I was in college. And she really liked what it is I had to say and asked if she could have a copy of it. And she began to quote me around our country. And that was how I got my first job in public service right after college. I spent time, obviously, in between that experience and coming back after 9/11, going to grad school and working in the private sector. But when 9/11 happened, Derrick, and all of us can remember exactly where we were. We know how we felt, what we saw, and we know the confusion that happened. For me, I was on the 41st floor of a building in Boston overlooking Logan Airport. And for those of you who are from Boston, Logan is this, gigantic appendage near the ocean. And on a beautiful, beautiful day on September 11th of 2001, I remember looking at Logan Airport, getting the news about something that had happened in New York, and just this sinking feeling and worried that, we didn't know what was happening, but I remember thinking to myself, I really hope this has nothing to do with anybody who is Muslim. I remember feeling that. And in the days afterwards, this is obviously pre-Facebook and pre-Google, we were getting news the old-fashioned way. We began to hear about the group called Al-Qaeda that was claiming responsibility. But for me, I walked into my boss's office and I said, Steve, I grew up in Massachusetts. This is home. I love working here. I love the job that I'm doing. But a terrorist organization is trying to claim my country. It's trying to define America, and it's trying to define my religion. And I can't sit here in Boston and continue. I have to go back into government. I have to serve. So 9/11 for me was a pivot point of inflection point for me in my career. I was fortunate enough to be able to come back into government to do anything. I didn't care what I did. I just knew that I wanted to do something because we had been attacked. So my journey in public service began again at 9/11, and the work that I did in various roles in government allowed me to talk about the issues that we will be discussing tonight. But it wasn't about who was in the Oval. Right. It was never about who was in the Oval, whether it was Obama or Bush. It was about who we are as Americans. It was about what we needed to be doing so that young kids were not getting radicalized. It was about finding a way for me to take my background and my knowledge and the things that I'd studied in graduate school and do something with it that could, in some tiny way, make a difference. So that my experience at state, my experience at the National Security Council, at the White House, and at USAID was all about listening to a generation of young Muslims around the world.
Right. Thanks, and it's a great sort of opening, and I'm going to dive into with some of the topics in the book, and right at the beginning you say, you know, there's a war being fought and we're losing it. And we've got several hundred people here with us tonight. Most of them, I think, would like to know what we can do so that we do win. And can you talk about the challenge, and what's the opportunity, and how we can make the difference that we're not currently making?
The challenge we face is fierce. You know, it really is. I couldn't have imagined on 9/11 that 20 years after this horrifying thing that we would be talking not just about Al-Qaeda, but we would be talking about Al-Qaeda resurgent. We'd be talking about a group called the so-called Islamic State. We'd be talking about the Taliban and Shabab and Boko, organizations, terrorist organizations that use the name of Islam for their nefarious ends. But in addition to all of that, here we are 20 years after 9/11, and we now have a surge in hate of all kinds. Right. We have a rise of anti-Semitism. We have a rise of white nationalism. We have all kinds of different kinds of us versus them ideologies in this toxic, horrible mix. And the problem we're facing is we're not winning on any of these fronts. Yeah. And what's happening is each of these movements, each of these organizations, each of these commitments for hate are learning from each other. And so we can't ignore how it's changing the very face of our daily experience as humans on this planet, and to take it right back home, even here in Portland, the way in which a young kid feels as they grow up in this country is dramatically different from even, you know, in a pre-9/11 world. So I look at the reality on the ground just generally, and then I look at the specifics of the kind of extremism that I worked on in the years after 9/11, and that was organizations, terrorist organizations that were preying upon one type of demographic, and that is young Muslims. They weren't trying to recruit Jews and Hindus and Christians and Buddhists. They were going after people that had some sort of connection to Islam as they saw it. And that number is gigantic, Derrick. Right. Today in the world, we have 1 billion Muslims under the age of 30. And there are no governments in the world that have deployed the kind of soft power tactics that will prevent the appeal of the ideology at scale. And so we're finding ourselves in a situation where young kids are being exploited and recruited. They are young, they're adolescents, their brains do not get developed, humans' brains do not get developed until the age of 24. We have a responsibility to protect our youth from hate. And what I see as dramatic and important is that while we have market-tested solutions, while we know what we need to do, we're in a far different place than we were right after 9/11 when we weren't sure what to do. We now know what needs to be done, and the reason why this book was written is because I don't want to sit back and say, yeah, we have the answers, but we're not using them. Right. I want people to understand that solutions are available, and they are affordable right now.
So you talked about soft power, and I was going to touch on this later, but let's dive into a little bit of that now. I mean, hard power, traditional, military or trade sanctions or the like, soft power, people-to-people diplomacy, a lot of what World Oregon does. In fact, we were talking backstage, we've had over 50 people in 7 different groups from 27 countries over the last 3 or 4 years come to this region specifically to connect with experts on how do we combat violent extremism. And as you noted, a big focus has been on combating white supremacy. And how do we, because that's been, the issue here, and we've had some real problems with that. And so, but that's just one small element of it. Can you talk a little bit more about how you differentiate hard and soft, and then the new sort of third power that you talk about?
What I found when I was at the State Department and also at the National Security Council and at the U.S. Agency for International Development, in the years that I spent in government, we have a toolbox of tried and tested procedures or tools, if you were, methods of how to deal with particular things. I don't have to go into the hard power piece. You guys all understand drones and soldiers and the fighting part of the war. But when you're dealing with something ideological, an us versus them ideology, we only have a limited group of tools really in our toolbox, or so we think. We have looked at these methods and we've thought this is the way you have to go about things. And okay, so that's great. We know that soft power exists, the non-lethal forms, the kinds of things that we can be doing. So why aren't our leaders deploying a strategy of hard and soft power together? You cannot win if you're only killing people. Ideologies have no borders. They don't die because you finished occupying a territory. For digital natives, who are the young people under the age of 30, these ideas exist. So we didn't see the kind of strategy that had hard and soft power together, integrated with respect, each of them. It was more of an unbalanced situation where we were putting all of our eggs in the hard power basket and sort of on the fringe talking about how important the ideological war was, when no resources, the personnel, the kind of innovations that needed to happen were not happening. That's frustrating enough. But what's even worse is that when we're looking at the kind of grand strategy that the bad guys are using around the world, offline and offline, what we have to be doing is to be competing with the kind of commitment and focus and attention in a way that's even more fierce than they. And we have not done that. So we've had an irregular ad hoc attempt at dealing with soft power. People are saying how important it is, but they haven't followed up. Now, what I have said in this book is, let's even out the playing field here. Let's put the kind of resources we need to put into the soft power piece, not just the kinds of programs that, and I should compliment WorldOregon for the kind of exchange programs you've done, the kind of IVLPs. I think they are essential, and I wish Congress would give the State Department more money to be able to do that tenfold. It is really, really important. And I've seen the kind of results of those kinds of programs firsthand. But I would also like to see the kind of innovation in the soft power field, the ideas that we haven't yet thought about. And for us to think about that, it requires us to be more open-minded, to open up our aperture, to think differently about how to solve a problem. And what I found is, in writing this book, that I sort of put a label on what that was. When I was at the State Department, I was bringing different kinds of people to the table to help me understand how to think differently. What's the thing I didn't see? So I want to see anthropologists and historians and behavioral scientists. We have totally missed the opportunity to bring child and adolescent experts into the mix as we try to figure out the kinds of programs that we need to build. How do you bring all these kinds of different kinds of people to the table? It's a kind of design thinking, if you will, and I call it open power. It's a derivative of soft power. It's the way in which you think about power differently rather than power over someone, which is what we have traditionally thought about power. It's power with. If you're going to solve a problem like extremism, it cannot be from the top down. It has to be multi-sectoral. It has to be community-driven. It has to be many different layered approaches of people who understand the different touch points of a young person as they go through this navigation of identity, which is in fact the central component of why and how the bad guys are able to recruit. So open power for me is a really important new way of thinking about how we solve this problem. And it is something that I felt was important to talk about in this book.
Right. Well, it's interesting, in the early chapters of the book you talk about some of that going online, and one of the people who introduced us actually to her work is Peter Singer, who many of you might remember hearing spoke several years ago for us, the International Speaker Series, and I remember this vividly because we had just had a moment where we told everybody to turn off their cell phones, and then Peter Singer got up and started talking about how everybody was on the internet, and ISIS had X number, dozens of Twitter handles and things, and we had all just sort of unilaterally disarmed by shutting off our phones. And so at the risk of frustrating, as I know some in the audience aren't wild about that, we have changed to try to say, we need to be part of this, we need to be part, in a proactive, positive way, be part of that. And to me, it sort of echoes back. I remember in the 90s, people were saying, well, we don't need to do programs like you're talking about because we have Blue Jeans and Britney Spears, and that's going to change the world. And
it did change.
Right, and but in sort of a very American kind of free market way. But now it seems, and I'd like to talk a little bit more how we can more deliberately go in, whether it's a person or the private sector, to use some of these tools to affect that change, rather than just sort of hoping that by wearing American jeans and listening to American music, that we're not going to have these problems, which I think is essentially what our de facto strategy was if we had one.
So I'd like to unpack that in a couple of different ways. One is, if the premise is that if you like America, you're not going to become an extremist, if that's your premise, you're wrong. Right. If you look at the way in which anyone who's become a terrorist, lives their life, they're using the internet, they're using devices and eating food and wearing clothes that would be made in places that they don't particularly like by people that they don't particularly like, it's not the right analysis to use. Right. It's the wrong analysis. It's also the wrong analysis that we used after 9/11, saying, this idea of winning hearts and minds, this idea that if we could just convince those people over there how great we are, they will like us enough that they won't join a terrorist organization. It doesn't work like that. What we understand, what I saw in nearly 100 countries around the world as special representatives to Muslim communities, talking to tens of thousands of Muslim youth, Muslims in Muslim majority countries, and Muslims that lived as minorities, the singular data point that blew my mind was that no matter where in the world I went, if you were under the age of 30 and Muslim, and were growing up then, post 9/11, that you were having a crisis of identity. You were asking questions about who you were, what the difference is between culture and religion, how to be a, quote, better Muslim, and the marketplace was flooded with answers that didn't come from the kinds of sources that you would wish they would come from. But rather, the marketplace was flooded offline and online with peers that were able to push a particular direction. Right. To say, if you are really going to be a real Muslim, you got to do it our way, this way. You had in an online space the bad guys who were able to deploy the kinds of messages in user-friendly ways that made sense for a young person, and we were nowhere to be found. We were, still talking about jeans and Coca-Cola, and why would they hate us, and so it took us a long time to understand how active we really have to be able to not just compete but overwhelm the focus and the commitment of the bad guys.
Well, and to follow up on that, one of the things that really intrigued us when we were researching you was talking about building Dumbledore's army. And for those of you who are Harry Potter fans, that needs no explanation. But for some of the audience who are not, can you talk a little bit more about what that means about engaging youth online and in their countries to be able to build that Dumbledore's army?
Well, I believe that we've been really lazy on hate in the course of the last 2 decades. I think we're all looking at somebody else to fix this problem for us. It's a choice we make. It's a choice we make. You can choose to be the person you are. You can choose to be in a community and in a neighborhood that tolerates hate, or you can stand up and say, this isn't who we are. At the very baseline, it's a choice. And that choice also goes to the next level when you think about what one person can do, what a one-on-one intervention can do. By the way, the bad guys recruit not en masse. They recruit one-to-one. They handpick what they're going to do and what messages they're going to send. It's the same way on the reverse. If you want to walk in somebody else's shoes, if you want to send the signal to somebody who looks like you, or it doesn't look like you, is different in gender, in race, in religion, in spirituality, whatever it happens to be, you have to make an effort to say, I'm going to choose to move in a forward direction and to open up a way to converse or to understand that other person, even if it means you're talking in a new way. And when I was teaching a class, a young person who was a millennial, I was talking about how peer-to-peer was essential, that it can't come from somebody else telling you how to be a better Muslim. It has to be somebody who's credible, that has authenticity, who makes sense, and it's usually a peer talking to another peer. And I was speaking about the kinds of programs that we built that were in fact peer-to-peer programs of people who were able to deploy that kind of message. And a young woman raised her hand in my class, Anisha, and she said, Farah, if you want people to understand what you mean, you need to tell us, meaning the millennials, that you're trying to build Dumbledore's army. And what she meant by that, and she was 100% right, is that each of us have our own magic wand. Each of us can fight hate in the way we know to do it. We have the capacity to do it. And in the Harry Potter books, it's about each of these young people and older people taking their wand out and fighting evil. It's coming together to do it in the way they know how. I know, because I've talked to citizens all over the world, that people don't want to live in hate. They don't want to live with an us versus them. They don't want to feel different. I've talked to parents who talk to me about their young Muslim kids who are growing up in schools in America and all over the world who are being asked to explain Al-Qaeda to a class. People who are looked at differently because they have a bindi, or they wear a yarmulke, or they have a cross, or they have a turban, or they have a headscarf. I mean, what kind of world are we living in? What do we want to be around? So we have to stand up for what it is that we want. We can't wait for government to get their act together. We can't wait for somebody else to do this. We've got to say what we stand for and do it now.
No, that's very powerful, and you know, that's why as an organization, World Oregon, rather than try to knock down every tweet that we disagree with, we've tried to proactively state our values and how fundamentally what we're about is to connect people who may have differing views or backgrounds or whatever, but give them an opportunity to have dialogue. And I mean, that's to me what is so powerful about what you say in this, is that it treats youth as equals and gives them empowerment to, you know, as our introductory speaker was saying, to be part of that change. I mean, you could just talk a little bit more about that, because I think it's very easy for people of our generation to tell the youth what to do rather than empower them to make positive decisions on their own.
Well, Rami was inspiring, and I'm really proud of her. I thought she did a great job, and she said some really important things. And I find in the conversations that I have with young people, and I spent some time this afternoon in a school here in the Portland environment talking with young Muslims. You know, we're looking at Generation Z and we're looking at millennials who aren't waiting until they have gray hair and big titles to think that they can do something. This is a different kind of generation, both of those different generations. And we need to understand that the solutions that they come up with are creative and make sense for them, and we need to help them. We can't say our way is the right way and you need to do it this way. We need to listen to their voices. And in the work that I did for Secretary Clinton and Secretary Kerry in building the kind of resilience in communities around the world, I had to listen. I didn't come from Washington to Tajikistan or Kenya or Morocco or Norway and say, let me tell you how to do this. I talked to the young people. I said, what will make sense? How can we, the government, be the convener and the facilitator and the intellectual partner with the ideas that we hear on the ground? What can we do to help you do the thing you want to do? And we built networks of like-minded thinkers around the world. One of my favorite networks was called Generation Change. And it was about these young people who wanted to fight extremist ideologies, from the Comoros to the Philippines to Ireland. they were interested in doing things their way in their community that they knew was going to work for them. And what we did was to listen to what they had to say, figure out what we could do to help them. Sometimes it was finding mentors for them. Sometimes it was connecting them to other like-minded peers in other parts of the world. We used the platform of Facebook, actually, to connect them so that everybody was given an even compass in doing this, that we didn't have a hierarchy of which of these communities were more important to somebody else. And I think that's another really important thing. When we begin to think that a region of the world is more important than another region of the world, we have really missed the boat here. The ideology that is seeping in of us versus them is everywhere. It's in every part of the world. And for the kind of extremism that I worked on with Muslims all over the world, I did go to places that were uncommon. And I remember, I'll say this to you because you're former State Department. When I first started doing the work that I'm describing here, I did it in Europe right after the Danish cartoon crisis. And I remember having conversations at the State Department where people were really annoyed that I was talking to Muslims in Europe because they kept telling me, Muslims in Europe, that's not really important. The priority areas are, the Middle East or Africa, and I would say, we have to get past this idea of the Middle East is the most important and the only place that you should talk to Muslims. They are important, and Muslims there are important, but so too are Muslims in other parts of the world. And we have to evenly talk about this. We should not have a hierarchy of who the most Muslim person is, because a Muslim in Suriname is as Muslim as a Muslim in Surabaya. So looking at the world differently, understanding that the generations that we're talking about, millennials and Generation Z, are talking to people across their generation, not because somebody's in Jordan and they'll only talk to somebody in Jordan. Of course not. They're going to talk with people who have ideas that have inspiration to them, and they feel that that person on the other side of the world may, in fact, have an idea that they can actually seed.
Right. Can you talk a little bit more about the diversity of Islamic thought and practice in different countries in the world, and how often in the U.S., we conflate Islam with the Middle East and don't look at that diversity? And in a book, you specifically dive into something about, you call the halalization of certain practices that are really beyond the scope of sort of normal religious teachings, but have tremendous influence on youth as they try to establish their identity. Can you talk a little more about that?
One of the things I try to do in this book is not to give a lecture to any of the readers about how to be a good Muslim or a bad Muslim. Who am I to talk about that? That's not my role. My role in this book was to share with you what I saw around the world and the phenomenon, the data points that I connected and said, this is happening. One of the things we've just discussed is the identity crisis that's happening all over the world. I wanted to talk about the system that's underlying extremism so that you, like me, could see what it is I saw in all these countries. And one phenomenon that really blew my mind was the idea of religion not as religion, but religion as a lifestyle brand. And I couldn't quite understand it when I first began to see it. I didn't know what I was seeing, and it finally sort of came together for me after about 30 or 40 countries that I'd visited, and I was seeing the same things over and over again, that the way we think about religion in the typical government ways is not the way we should be looking at the way people are expressing it. One. Two, the diversity of Islam is really our friend, obviously. The bad guys want you to believe that a monolithic one version of Islam is the way to go. So it's in our best interest to make sure that we speak and talk and understand about the diversity of Islam and do what it is I just said, that we have to give honor to all Muslims everywhere in the world, the way we do with Christians. We don't talk about Christians in Germany being more Christian than the Christians in India. I mean, we don't speak like that. Why should we do that with the faith of Islam? But that aside, what I saw was, for young people anywhere in the world growing up, we know that all of us, every single one of us, as we grow up, we ask questions about what it means, what's the purpose of life, what are we supposed to do, who am I? That's just normal growing up. But for the young people that grew up post 9/11 that saw the word Islam or Muslim on the front pages of papers, online and offline, every single day to this day, 24/7, it's had a profound effect in the generations that we're talking about, that I'm talking about. And what that's done is it's created this heightened sense of identity, this need to express that being Muslim. And what that has translated in with digital natives is a compilation of erasure, of historic heritage and culture of their own places, and replacing it with a monolithic kind of expression of how to dress and how to eat and how to be, almost as if they were telling stories to their peers. Look at me, look how Muslim I am. Look, I'm wearing that bracelet you want me to wear, or I'm drinking that right kind of, soda. I talk about the halalization. That's a weird word I just created for this to explain it to myself, but it was an expression of the fragility of the identity crisis rather than anything else. It was a fragility of identity because they so needed to demonstrate to their peers that they were being Muslim, even whatever that meant. Even if they weren't pious, they were showcasing that Muslimness. So what do I mean by that? I went to New Zealand, and there was a person who was selling halal water. There's no such thing, just FYI. But people would buy it. I mean, it's more expensive to show people, look at the kind of water I'm drinking. Kind of like, there are people in this audience who have on their wrists a Fitbit. I know you do. And some of you are really healthy and really care a lot about what's on that Fitbit, and you're monitoring it really carefully. Some of you have it on because somebody gave it to you, or you want to seem like you're really healthy, right? It's kind of like showing everybody. Right. It was the same kind of thing with this. They would tie their headscarf a very particular way. They'd wear very particular things. They'd want that brand associated with how to be a Muslim, whether they were devout or not devout. It's just the way they looked. So I talk about this not because you should be scared about somebody who expresses their identity or their faith in that way. That's not the point here. The point is, with millennials and Generation Z, that phenomenon, that need to feel and showcase that Muslimness is a very important thing for us to understand, because the bad guys prey upon that seeking, that sense of I need to belong, I need my peers to like me, to think I'm really Muslim, to find that real thing that they are putting out there, which is obviously not a real thing, but it's what they have marketed it to be.
Right. Well, and it struck me as I was reading the book that, I've seen white supremacists who've done similar things with trying to influence youth with certain, images and T-shirts and hand symbols that pop up, in the background of photos. And, and some people do it knowingly and some others don't. It strikes me that it's something that across the board we need to be prepared about with youth, as far as, what kind of messages are they getting, and is there any counter messaging? And like you said, it's not subject just to one religion or culture. I've seen this in many different areas.
And the scary part, let me just be really clear about this. We started off the conversation about what the threat is, and I made this statement that it's more serious today than it was on 9/11. And I look at the way the white supremacists are using the ISIS playbook to learn. They're watching what ISIS did. They're looking at how they were so successful in recruiting offline and online. They were understanding the kinds of consistency with branding, the kinds of messages that they needed to put out there. It's all about identity and belonging. Even though those two movements are so different from each other, they still need recruits. You can't have an army if you don't have recruits. And so they're committed to making sure that they are choosing to develop this so that it is like a lifestyle. It is a way of thinking, it's a way of dressing, it's a way of eating and praying and all of the things that go into your daily life.
Without being negative, I think there's a lot of concern that some of those, extremist messages, whether you're talking about white supremacy or Al-Qaeda or others, have won some of the messaging, and because we're playing catch up to a certain extent, like you talked about, the fighting on the hard power, we've been effective in many ways, but on the soft or the open power, we have been playing catch up. And so, to what extent is that the case, that we're essentially fighting a rearguard action against an ideology that is frankly won some ground that we ceded to them?
Well, we can either cede it and say it's too difficult, we can't boil the ocean, we can never do anything. I've heard statements from very senior people who have said to me, Farah, this is going to take hundreds of years. This is a Muslim problem. They have to figure it out for themselves. There's nothing we can do. I mean, I've heard all of that. I've been doing this work for a long time, and I've heard the arguments of why we can't, why we can't, why we can't. I don't buy it. This is the United States of America. Yeah. We have innovation in our blood. We figure out how to do things. Yeah. You can change a country and teach us how to recycle. You can change the way we think about things that we never thought we could change, and our behavior changes because we've devoted ourselves, we've committed ourselves, we've had the private sector and government and regular citizens working for people to understand why it's important to recycle or what you need to do. We've changed things. People would have said 30, 40 years ago, impossible. Americans like the whatever. I don't think Americans deserve or want to be in a place that is filled with hate. We can find a way to do things in schools and in our libraries and with parent teaching, and technology companies can get with the program and stand for something positive and to do something good. I'm not Pollyanna, I never was, but I have understood essentially that on a localized level, if you go local community to local community, we can transform commitment and our actions to things like recycling, to things like smoking, to things like fighting hate.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to have another question of mine, and then I'm going to start weaving in some of our audience questions. I had a really interesting chapter about the influential role of Saudi Arabia, who is one of our erstwhile partners on a lot of issues, and yet fundamentally a problem in the way they're acting on a lot of other issues from the way you describe it in the book. Can you dive into that a little bit more?
Derrick, one of the things that was very important to me when I left the State Department, I had, in fact, the best job in government. I loved being special representative to Muslim communities. It was an honor, but it was also a privilege. But I knew that I had seen things that I couldn't talk about when I was in government. One of the things was the impact of Saudi Arabia that I had seen all over the world. I know that they have had, and they still do, and they will continue to have, a close relationship with us. I'm not calling for us to abandon our relationship with Saudi Arabia. I'm calling for Americans to understand what 3 to 4 decades of a commitment from Saudi Arabia has been, with billions of dollars around the world, that has set the stage of an us versus them in a way that results in the ability for terrorist organizations to grow. And though they have been brilliant and super successful in what they've done, we have looked the other way for a very long time, and I don't think the American public actually understands the kind of changes that have happened in communities all over the world and in our own country that is directly from the way in which Saudi Arabia has deployed their tactics. What do I mean? I'm not calling for us to, I want us to think differently. That's a better way of saying it. I want us to think differently about a monolithic view of how to be a Muslim, and why, going back to what I said earlier, why that is important for us to fight. We want the diversity of Islam. Saudi Arabia has put forward this idea that there is only one way to be Muslim, and it's their way. And so everything that they're doing is trying to convince young people to abandon historic ways of expressing themselves and erasing the way they have, for hundreds of years, practiced their religion. They've called on communities to abandon the ability for other kinds of a display of religion. They have included textbooks that they have published in Saudi Arabia they have given for free around the world that call on a whole host of different things. I remember pulling off of the shelf in Leicester, United Kingdom, a textbook from Saudi Arabia that talked about how all Jews were pigs. It is worse than that. It goes even more into horrible learnings, if you will. I think about ISIS, and I think about the fact that ISIS used Saudi textbooks when they first began to build their so-called caliphate because the ideology was so aligned. So free textbooks, free translations of the Quran that translate the Quran in a very particular way. For those of you who are interested in that component of their strategy, I strongly recommend a book by Zia Sardar, who talks about it extensively. I quote him in the book, but there's a lot to be said so you can really see how they've translated things differently. Those free Qurans have gone all over the world. They've also gone into American prisons. So we have those tools in their toolbox. In addition to that, and I could go on for a very long time, they've also had all kinds of different kinds of approaches to making sure that people are trained their way and deployed in other parts of the world, changing forever the way people express themselves. Now, we can either sit here in America and say, well, that's happening over there, and it doesn't really matter to us what happened to Kosovo or what happened to Bosnia, and why should we care that people are being asked to express themselves differently. We should care because that kind of us versus them is directly related to the way in which terrorist organizations can build off of things. And so what I talk about in this book is the work that they've done over 3 to 4 decades with billions of dollars and the strategy they successfully deployed to be able to do all of this. And I'm not calling for us to never be don't have a relationship with Saudi Arabia. I'm saying for us to do what we do with a country like China, being harsh on some things and soft on other things, we need to get real on the issue of what they're doing around the world to spread a very particular ideology.
So I'm going to pivot from that, critiquing another country's policy, to we got a couple questions critiquing U.S. policy. And as you walked in, some of you might have seen, we had a couple protesters talking about Elliot Abrams, who is now in the Trump administration, was previously in the Bush administration, and is a point person related to Venezuela. And a specific question by someone who I think supports some of the protests, saying the U.S. government has destroyed countries all over the world. I would beg to differ, but that's the question. And you speak about talking out against hate. Why don't you speak about actions that could be defined as terrorism by the U.S.? Can you talk a little bit about that? Address the protesters. We're a town who likes protests, and we believe in freedom of speech.
I believe in freedom of speech too.
So we wanted to give you an opportunity to address that.
I want to thank you. Because I think it's important. I didn't get to meet the protesters, I mean, I don't even know why we call them. They're expressing themselves.
Sure.
And that's great. I have several things to say about that. One, I want to tell you, I'm not here today to talk about Venezuela because I'm really not an expert on it, and I don't know the ins and outs of what the Trump administration is actually calling on. So I don't want to speak directly to that issue, but
Sure.
I do want to talk about how important it is for us to understand. I speak about part of this in the book, by the way, where no matter where in the world I went, people would call on American foreign policy as an example of our true commitment to hate Muslims. And if you could only look at the things that we did here, it will prove to you that we hate Muslims. And so it was, the war in Iraq. It was what we were doing in Afghanistan. It was what we did, 50 years ago in this part of the world. It was, the long list of all of the things that we've done from a foreign policy point of view. You and I both know foreign policy is far more complicated than that. You also know that our foreign policy is not designed around religion or race. We do not have a relationship with India because it is a Hindu majority country. We have complex relationships. We do things for a whole host of different reasons. It's not always easy and comfortable, and one doesn't ever work for anybody that you believe every single thing that that person does is the right thing. You know that as a Foreign Service officer. We both know that whether you're civil service, Foreign Service, or a political appointee, no one person can buy into absolutely everything that happens in an administration. So that's important to put on the table. I also want to say something about, I have no problem with you protesting me because of who I worked for or when I worked for people. I was really lucky to have a chance to serve our nation after 9/11. And I worked on Elliot's team with pride, and he's one of the smartest people I have ever met. He allowed me to learn about how important it was to talk to civil society. The work that he did in the Reagan administration on human rights was essential for me as I was understanding how critical it was to build coalitions and to understand what civil society was doing. So I think it's fine. You can say whatever you wish about Elliot or me or what I did, but I am grateful to be in a country in which you can express that. And I urge you to read the first couple of chapters in the book, which talk about the things that I experienced when I worked with Elliot in the Bush administration and the team around him on how we decided to develop the importance of the approach that we are talking about here in fighting the ideological war. Some of the most important lessons on what we built was because people like Elliot allowed me the running room to experiment and to say to me, it's okay if you fail, Farah. It's okay if you fail. Experiment, try, listen to what those NGOs are saying, see what it is that you can do. If I worked for somebody who said, only do things that we know that you're going to win or you're going to be really perfect on, I would never have been able to do the work I did that resulted in the understanding of what we had to do in a bigger way. When Hillary Clinton asked me to be special representative to Muslim communities, I was on my way out from the Bush administration.
Right.
And I briefed her on the work we did in the Bush administration, on the very thing I'm talking about with civil society. And you know what she said? She didn't ask me how Muslim I was. She didn't ask me how Republican or Democrat or independent I was. She listened to what I was saying needed to be done on the ground, and she said to me, you aren't leaving, and I want you to do what you did in Europe, but I want you to do it around the world. And we have to get to a place where we can open up our minds about solutions and not just get stuck on when and how you learned how to do something.
So as a follow-up question, one of the audience members asks what you think of the Trump administration's quote-unquote Muslim ban on travel, and I would just take that to follow on with their question. Your thoughts on their approach to this issue.
For some of you may have seen, I've written quite a lot publicly on the way President Trump has decided to speak about Islam and Muslims. For a lot of different reasons, it breaks my heart that this is the kind of situation we are in America today, where the United States president feels that it's necessary to do that. One of the first things I did when I became special representative, by the way, because I didn't know enough, I will tell you that, despite how lucky I was in my education. I didn't know enough about what American presidents had said about Islam and diplomacy and Muslims. I didn't know enough. And so I worked with a woman named Precious Muhammad, who was trained at Harvard, and she's a historian. And I said, Precious, can we look at all of the American presidents, starting with George Washington? I want to learn what it is that they've said. What did they do, you know? And I'm so grateful to her. I learned so much, but here's the headline. Every single American president, I say this with pride as an American, every single American president from George Washington until Barack Obama spoke with dignity, spoke with respect about Islam and Muslims. Whether you were George Washington, whether you were Eisenhower, whether you were Clinton, whether you were Carter, whether you were Bush, whether you were Obama, you did things that were exceptional. President George W. Bush was the first president in American history to put a Quran in the White House library. President Eisenhower gave free land in Washington, D.C. to build a mosque because there was no place for Muslims in Washington to pray. I mean, I am proud as an American to see that. President Clinton had the first celebration at the White House in modern history around the holy month of Ramadan. I mean, there are things that we can be proud of. And it's important when we go overseas to talk about who we are as Americans. Because even though nothing is perfect, everything cannot be perfect, we still have a constitution that gives rights to everybody. We still are a country in which there's a synagogue and a temple and a church and a mosque can be on the same street. We still are a country where you can express your religion with pride, even despite the difficult challenges we are facing today. But it becomes essential when we go overseas to be able to talk about that country. And so all the rumor mills of the super secret things that we are really doing and why we're doing things actually can be put aside. You may not like our policy in Iraq, you may not like our policy in Pakistan, but let me tell you that as an American and as a Muslim growing up, it was okay, I could practice my religion freely. But when you have a president that goes out and decides that they are going to fiercely discuss faith in a way that has been contrary to the 44 presidents that came before, we have a problem. So for me, it isn't just about the Muslim ban. It's about the dignity we're giving to all faiths and all people.
So as you talk about this, it reminds me of, I wanted to see if you've come across this American sort of grown online help for combating violent extremism called Average Muhammad from the Minneapolis area.
Yes.
For those of you who haven't seen it, it's pretty amazing. This gentleman was actually recently given an award by a group that WorldOregon participates with, Global Ties US, which helps facilitate international exchanges. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that, because it's very powerful to see. And is that the type of thing that we should be doing more of?
And we are doing it. We're working with them. So here's the thing. An adult is not the person who can connect to a teenager or a young person to talk about identity, because, I mean, for those of you who are parents, your kids aren't coming to you. They're going to their peers to get answers. You know that. They're going to their friends. We are not in a situation where, unfortunately, kids are looking to grandparents or parents for answers. They're looking to peers for answers. And what we want to do is we want to curate a whole host of different kinds of ways in which young people can get messages about identity and agency and belonging from their peers that make sense. And this gentleman in Minneapolis is able to talk about identity and belonging and how to navigate through those things in a way that's actually user-friendly for the peer group that they're talking about. We lifted up voices like his. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of small nonprofit organizations all over this country that need our help in being able to scale up the kind of solutions that we're talking about. And that's where we can come in. This is where I want to see a difference. It's not that we don't know what to do, it's that we haven't been able to help them scale what needs to be done. So it isn't a silver bullet, like you only need to do this in an online space with YouTube videos, or it only needs to be a cartoon, or it only needs to be a poetry jam, or it only needs to be a hackathon. No, we need to bring in a lot of different ways to talk about these issues, because something will work for one person, it won't work for somebody else. But that's an example of a really great program that we need to see more of. And by the way, there's one other thing that's really essential here in America, which I love to talk about overseas. America is two things. One, Islam came to this country at the very beginning of this country. It came with the slaves. So it has been part of this country from the very beginning. And we need to remember that in how we teach history, how we talk about history, and how we think about ourselves as Americans. The second thing is, this country has the most diverse group of Muslims anywhere in the world. And that's really powerful. And some of the work that Average Muhammad is doing is, in fact, talking about that diversity of expression. And that's really key.
So as we talk about this, and you dive into the book, the private sector's role, I have a question here from actually one of our alums from our Young Leaders in Action program about how, given all the platforms that these conversations are going on are fundamentally American ones, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, these are all American companies. So how do you think, or what are their ethical implications to increasing, intensifying American influence over social media, targeting youth in the Middle East in the name of combating terrorism? I mean, her worry is, how do we accomplish this without imposing what we think, as opposed to providing a platform for, self-description and self-actualization?
Well, one of the things that I call for in the book, in a chapter called Shake Google, is that the technology companies need to recognize that they can no longer stick to their public relations lines that they have been using for the last decade, which is, we don't know enough, we don't really understand what's going to work, we didn't know, we don't have a responsibility, we believe in free speech, all of these things that they have unpacked to the world as their excuse for not doing more. I have to say, because it's not fair for me to get mad at them without telling you that they have, in fact, each one of the big tech companies has, in fact, worked on fighting hate in some capacity. Some of them work with NGOs around the world and also here in America. They are looking at hate speech. They are designing different systems, but they're not doing it fast enough, and they're not doing it at scale. The problem that we have is fierce. Facebook is one of the largest governments in the world. And if you look at it like that, it is a nation that has to have protocols in how we think about how you live in that platform and what's acceptable. One of the answers Facebook gave everybody was that they were looking at online speech, they were looking at hate speech, and they had hired 10,000 people to actually look at speech to take it down. I'm sorry, 10,000 people is nothing compared to the capacity of the people who are on that platform. It's nothing. So I want tech companies to meet us in the place where that is giving us respect for what we know that they can do. And it's not to say that they have to only devise ways of watching and focusing on one particular kind of user. It's to say, what can they be doing in the communities to be working with others who want to deploy far more content, other methods online, to be able to showcase a young person their navigation of identity in a different way. You're not telling them how to be a Muslim, but you are not allowing the bad guys to only get the only word out there on how to be a Muslim, for example.
So another student question from the Oregon Islamic Academy, part of the Muslim Educational Trust. What do you think we could do to help prevent negative images of Muslims displayed on the media?
The greatest strength of America, by the way, I had a wonderful time there this afternoon, and I have to call them out because this is the holy month of Ramadan, and many of those kids were fasting. So for them to spend time with me and to be as committed and focused, that meant a lot to me. I really, really did. So thank you for that. One of the things that I think is that when I look at the power of the United States, one of the greatest strengths we have is coalitions that we build. And it isn't about one group that has to take on the burden of everything by themselves. Can I tell a really short story?
Yeah, of course.
When I was at the State Department, you heard my role. I was special representative to Muslim communities. There's also somebody at the State Department, a different role. It's a congressionally mandated role called the Special Envoy to Combat and Monitor Anti-Semitism. It is a very different set of criteria of the work that she had to do. When, in fact, we were both asked to go to Kazakhstan to take part in a conference on behalf of the United States, we were supposed to come to the conference. There were 4 panels. One was on something that they called Islamophobia. One was on what they called Christophobia. One was on anti-Semitism, and one was on everything else. I'm not joking. That's what it was called, everything else. But the American government had to give a response, a statement on how we thought about these issues. And so we had very carefully curated responses for the State Department. We went there to Kazakhstan to stand up, and when they called on America, to speak on this. And so the day before the event, Hannah Rosenthal was the envoy to combat and monitor anti-Semitism. She said, she's a little bit, I love her. She's very spicy, and she had a glimmer in her eyes, and she said, I have an idea. And she said, we didn't, by the way, get any clearance from the State Department when we did this, but what she said is the messenger matters. okay? So what we did is we swapped speeches. And the next day, when they called on America to speak on behalf, read our statement on anti-Semitism, I stood up. And when it was time for us to speak on Islamophobia, Hannah stood up and read the statement. And we ended it with a brand new paragraph about hate is hate, no matter who the victim is. And it was, trust me, diplomatic events are kind of boring. This was not, this was wild.
She's right.
Because people couldn't understand what had happened. Why did the American, why did we do this? But the point here was that the messenger did matter, but the next step was even better, because civil society came to us and said, it's really great that you did that in Kazakhstan, but you should use your platform to do more. And what we decided to take that on and think about it differently was, how do you walk in somebody else's shoes? How do you build coalitions of like-minded thinkers in new ways, so that it's not only the community that's being affected that is standing up, that you're holding side by side with others who are different than you and can do this with you? We launched a campaign called Hours Against Hate, which was asking a young person to volunteer an hour or more of their time for someone who doesn't look like you, live like you, love like you, or pray like you. And we thought we would get a few thousand hours, devoted to this. And what ended up happening is it turned into this global movement, so much so that the London Olympics and Paralympics took this on as their one of the movements that was part of it. So to the young person who asked this question, you can be as creative as you want about breaking down stereotypes, but you don't have to do it alone.
Well, following up on that, I have a question, but I want to cite something in the book. There's a great anecdote you write about your mom, after she moved to the South, joining a neighbor's Bible study class and discussion group, and it was a very powerful story. And I thought of that as I read this question we got from a student in the audience. Did the 9/11 attack impact you, and I would add, or your family, in any way as like a personal sense of discrimination or hate? And I thought about that story and your mom's outgoingness. Can you, if you feel comfortable, could you talk about it?
I'm grateful for that question. I haven't been asked it a lot, actually, but one of the things, there are two parts to this. One is the story about my mom. My mom is a retired physician. She's a pulmonologist. She practiced medicine in the Boston area. She ran a hospital, a county hospital. So she worked in the public sector as well. When she retired, she wanted to go somewhere warm. And she is a gardener, so she wanted to go to someplace where the soil was good for her roses. So she went to the Atlanta area, and my mom is an avid reader. She's very spiritual. She is a healer. And one day, early in she had moved into a neighborhood in the Atlanta area, and she had gotten to know some of the neighbors, but one of the neighbors came over to her. Her name is Hilda. And Hilda, mom was working in her garden, and Hilda was talking about her roses, or, talking to my mom. And my mom said to her, Hilda, I noticed on Wednesday mornings there are a lot of cars in front of your house. What's going on? In a very friendly way. And Hilda said, oh, it's our Bible study class. We have it on Wednesday mornings. And my mom said, oh my gosh, that's wonderful. What are you studying? And so Hilda said, we're studying women of the Bible, or the Old Testament, sorry. And my mom got really excited, and she said, oh my gosh, that's wonderful. Do you think I could come? And she realized the minute she said it that she had put Hilda in a really awkward position. Mom was new to the neighborhood, and Hilda was gracious and said, well, let me talk to the deacon, and I'll be back to you. And the next day, Hilda called my mom and said, of course, you're welcome to come. So my mom has been part of this Bible study group for 10 years, and it's been amazing and active, but they are family to my mom. They've been family to me. But the point here is that it's an unusual thing, right? I mean, my mom said to them, if you have questions about Islam, let me help you answer them. And the Bible is a holy book for Muslims too. Let me be part of this. And it is an uncommon thing, and it was because so many questions were present in a post-9/11 world for that community. They didn't have answers. They saw things on TV, and they thought they knew things. So for Mom, that was a way for her to contribute. For me, it's been a little bit different. I never thought about my Muslim identity growing up, really. I would go to Sunday school because that's when we went to regular school on Fridays. So on Sundays, my uncle and my cousins and my brother and me we would go to a school, to a mosque in Quincy, Massachusetts, that I would learn how to read the Quran, I would learn about my faith, and we would have religious classes, and that was my Sunday, but I never thought much more about it. My faith was personal to me. 9/11, in the immediate aftermath, I didn't really feel personally anything different, but what's interesting now, and that's why I'm taking a long time to answer this question, in the last 2 years it's been different, and I never would have expected that. People say things to me that blow my mind. People ask me why I speak English so well. They do. People ask me how somebody who's not American could serve our country. People ask me things like that, which surprise me because I'm obviously an American and I'm a proud American, and I've sacrificed, as you have, in many ways to serve our nation, not as much as those who serve in the military, for sure. But service is something that comes in different forms. But I find it very interesting. Something has changed in our country. And people ask me really weird questions about Islam and being Muslim in ways that never happened. I'm 51 years old. I've been in this country for 50 years, and no one has asked those questions, and they're asking them now. So I appreciate the question. I don't think anybody is immune to the us versus thems, and you happen to be asking about it vis-a-vis me being Muslim. But I can promise you people of different ethnicities and heritages and faiths in our country are dealing with all kinds of things in the context of what's happening today.
So 2 more questions before we wrap up tonight. One is following up on that. We had an incredible, powerful, personal example of, I referenced the Portland Trailblazers at the beginning, Enes Kanter, who was fasting for Ramadan while playing in the NBA playoffs. An incredible, positive example, and it was striking how much then in pop culture was being discussed. So that, on the positive note, on a sort of, I'd put in a question mark note, and I'm not being flippant, but Aladdin, the live-action movie, just came out.
Yes.
It's, popular and controversial, and I'm also not kidding, but at one point there was a poll where some pollster polled Americans on, do you think we should bomb the city of Agrabah, which for those who've seen the movie, it's like the mythical city in the movie, and a strikingly large percentage of the population said, yes, we should bomb it. And so pop culture, getting back to what we talked about, is huge influence. So, do you have any thoughts about that and like how Hollywood and these kind of, which can seem like they're just a Saturday afternoon at the movies, can have such a profound impact?
I talk a lot about Hollywood and the media in my book. I talk a lot about the impact on young children when you start stereotyping. I talked a little bit tonight about history and how we teach history and what real history is. And I think it's critical that we rethink what we are teaching in schools so that we are accurate and the old stories are not the only stories that we hear. We are lucky. We're in a science age. We can prove with science what happened and where it happened. So there's a lot more we can do. Hollywood needs to take responsibility. I remember right after 9/11, and this also happened, by the way, both in Obama and in Bush administrations, we asked Hollywood to do far more to play a role in the way in which they were stereotyping and what they were thinking in terms of storylines. And this is not just in big movies like Aladdin or but also in shows like 24 or Homeland. It's what you absorb every single day, and for some people, it's the first time they're seeing something about this. So there's a great responsibility to give Hollywood, writ large, credit. More conversations have happened around this, and in fact, changes have happened. I do talk about the role of Disney in my book. I do call them out because I think that they have an outsized role to play globally in how we talk about not just gender, but also different faiths and cultures and all of those kinds of things. And it's not just cute stories and cute songs. It's going a step further. I thought rather that after there was a lot of controversy when Aladdin first came out, the cartoon version, about how you pronounced Aladdin versus Aladdin, and that conversation went on for a really long time. It doesn't seem to me that they've taken some of those lessons and applied them to the rollout. I have not seen the film, so I don't know. I would hope that they would do more and use this opportunity to talk more about what they can do. I do talk about a film in my book that I had not seen and that I luckily got to watch, called Zootopia. Has anybody seen that? So that's an example, a positive example of stereotypes breaking down and what they consciously did around those themes. So it can be done, and it also can be successful. You don't have to lose money by doing the right thing.
So closing out with a student question from the International School Beaverton, and this kind of coalesces a couple questions we got. To what extent can U.S. national interests cohere with global interest of peace and economic justice, regardless of the administration? So what that means to me is, how can we do some of this, regardless of the ups and downs of whatever political officials may be in office? What can we as citizens most effectively do to make a difference on this issue?
Ask your mayors and your governors to stand for something. There are mayors in our country, luckily, that have deployed a creative solution to how they think about hate. Look at Mayor Tate in Anaheim, California. Look at Mayor Greg Fisher in Louisville, Kentucky. One of those mayors has built a city of compassion. The other has built a city of kindness. What's your mayor doing? Secondly, we have a presidential election next year. I don't know if you heard. There is not one candidate who has a strategy on soft power, on how to puncture the us versus them ideology. Ask them why.
So thank you so much for joining us today. If you want to hear more, I encourage you to listen online to our incredible interview with a much more professional interviewer from OPB. Fantastic discussion earlier today. And look for later when we'll have more of this up online on our website. Please join me again in thanking our incredible speaker.
Thank you. Get the book.